Canada just said no. Not quietly, not diplomatically, loudly, publicly, and directly to Donald Trump's face 5 times over. I'm going to walk you through exactly what happened, what was demanded, and why the man standing in the Oval Office across from the most powerful person on earth looked Trump dead in the eyes and said, "It's not for sale. Won't be for sale ever." That moment didn't happen by accident. It was the culmination of over a year of relentless pressure. Tariffs, annexation threats, economic ultimatums, a sustained campaign from Washington designed to bring Canada to its knees. And what you're watching right now is Canada's answer to all of it. But here's where it gets complicated. Because this isn't just a story about trade. It isn't just about tariffs or steel or aluminum. This is a story about whether the old rules of the world still apply. Whether a smaller country can look a great power straight in the eye and refuse to blink, and whether doing so will cost them everything or save them. Let me give you the backdrop first, because you need this to understand how high the stakes actually are. When Donald Trump returned to the White House in January 2025, one of his first moves was to declare a national emergency. Not because of a war, not because of a natural disaster, but because of Canada. He invoked the International Emergency Economic Powers Act and slapped a 25% tariff on most Canadian goods and 10% on Canadian energy. The stated reason, fentanyl. The Trump administration claimed Canada was a pipeline for deadly drugs flooding into America. Now wait, it gets worse. Here's what the data actually showed. According to U.S. Customs and Border Protection's own seizure records, Canada accounts for roughly 0.2%. That's 0.2 of total fentanyl seized at U.S. borders. Not 20%, not 2%, 98% of fentanyl entering the United States comes through the southern border, but Canada got the 25% tariff anyway. And then the demands started rolling in one after another, 5 of them, each one more aggressive than the last. Demand number 1, crack down on fentanyl and illegal border crossings. Canada, despite the data showing almost no fentanyl actually crosses its border with the U.S., immediately mobilized. They announced a $1.3 billion border security plan. They appointed a fentanyl czar. They listed 7 transnational criminal organizations as terrorist entities. They launched a joint strike force. They did everything Washington asked, and here's what nobody's talking about. It didn't matter. The tariffs went up anyway. On March 4th, 2025, 25% tariffs hit Canadian goods across the board. Then, by August of that same year, Trump escalated, signing an executive order raising them again, this time to 35%. The message from Washington was clear. Compliance doesn't buy you safety. The demands were never really about fentanyl. That's the moment Mark Carney, former governor of the Bank of Canada, former governor of the Bank of England, a man who has stared into the eyes of financial catastrophe and pulled economies back from the edge, that's the moment he understood exactly what this was. This wasn't a negotiation. This was an ultimatum. And so he prepared to say no 5 times. But this is the part that kept me up last night, because what Carney was really doing wasn't just defending Canada. He was making a calculation, a cold, analytical central banker's calculation, that capitulation doesn't work. That every concession made without reciprocity simply invites the next demand. That the only way through this is to hold the line, absorb the pain, and restructure an economy to be less dependent on a neighbor that has decided to use that dependency as a weapon. That calculation is either a masterclass in strategic resilience or the most expensive political bet in Canadian history. And right now we are watching the results come in. Let's go through the 5 demands one by one, because once you understand what was actually being asked, Carney's refusals start to look a lot less like stubbornness and a lot more like survival. Demand number 1, we already covered: stop fentanyl, secure the border. Canada did all of it and still got hit with tariffs. But demand number 2 is where things started getting genuinely extraordinary. Demand number 2, fix the trade deficit, give the United States better access, renegotiate the deal. Trump's obsession with bilateral trade deficits is well documented. The idea that if Canada sells more to America than America sells to Canada, then America is somehow losing, that America is being ripped off. Economists across the political spectrum will tell you this is a fundamental misreading of how trade works. A trade deficit isn't a loss. It's a reflection of the fact that both countries are buying what the other produces most efficiently. The United States runs a trade deficit with almost every major trading partner. That's not a sign of weakness. That's a sign of a wealthy country with high consumer purchasing power. But here's where it gets complicated. The tariffs that were supposed to fix this deficit didn't fix it. They couldn't fix it because the United States and Canada don't just trade products, they build things together. A single automobile part can cross the U.S.-Canada border 6, 7, 8 times before it ends up in a finished vehicle. The North American auto industry isn't an American industry. And a Canadian industry trading with each other, it's one integrated continental system. When you put tariffs on the crossings, you don't hurt Canada and help America. You inject friction into a shared machine, and both sides start losing output. Carney didn't reject this demand by throwing up his hands. He responded by saying the current USMCA trade agreement needed to change, but on terms that actually make sense. He launched negotiations for a new bilateral framework, stood firm that any deal had to be good for Canada, and simultaneously began a 12-deal trade diversification push across 4 continents in 6 months. And then this happened. Demand number 3, join the United States Board of Peace. This one sounds almost benign until you dig into what it actually was. Trump unveiled this proposal at Davos, a new international governing body chaired by himself, originally conceived around Gaza, but with ambitions Trump described as eventually rivaling the United Nations. Countries wanting permanent seats had to pay $1 billion. Trump invited Canada. Carney initially said he had received the invitation and was reviewing it. Days later, he stood at the World Economic Forum podium and delivered a speech that received a standing ovation. A speech in which he warned that great powers had begun using economic integration as weapons, tariffs as leverage, financial infrastructure as coercion. He did not name Trump by name. He didn't have to. Trump's response came within hours. He publicly declared at Davos that Canada lives because of the United States. Remember that, Mark, the next time you make your statements. And that same night, via social media, Trump withdrew Canada's invitation to the Board of Peace entirely. Carney's response to that. He went home to Ottawa and told reporters, "I meant what I said." Now, what I'm about to show you changes the whole picture. Because while all of this public drama was playing out, the trade war, the tariffs, the Border of Peace standoff, demand number 4 was quietly being applied behind the scenes, and this one was existential. Demand number 4. Do not pursue a trade deal with China. Canada had been doing what any rational country does when its primary trading partner starts acting unpredictably. It started diversifying. Carney announced a limited trade arrangement with China, not a comprehensive free trade agreement, a deal that modestly reduced tariffs in a handful of sectors that had recently been hit with levies. To hear Carney describe it, it was a modest, carefully constructed economic hedge. Trump's framing was something else entirely. His social media post declared that China was completely taking over Canada. He threatened a 100% tariff on all Canadian goods if the China arrangement moved forward. Wait, it gets worse. The United States Treasury Secretary publicly suggested that Carney was virtue signaling to his globalist friends at Davos, a pointed, politically charged accusation designed to paint Canada's prime minister as a threat to American economic security for the crime of making trade deals with other countries. Carney's response was measured and unambiguous. Canada is not pursuing a comprehensive free trade deal with China. The existing arrangement is limited, transparent, and consistent with commitments under USMCA. He explained this directly to Trump in a 30-minute phone call. He said Trump was impressed. Whether that's permanent or temporary remains to be seen. But none of that, not the fentanyl compliance, not the USMCA negotiations, not the Board of Peace decision, not the China arrangement, came anywhere close to demand number 5 in terms of raw audacity. Demand number 5, become the 51st state. I want you to sit with that for a moment. The President of the United States in the Oval Office with cameras rolling, with the Prime Minister of Canada sitting across from him, openly pushed for Canada to surrender its sovereignty and merge with the United States. And he kept pushing it for months, repeatedly, publicly. He posted digitally altered maps on social media showing Canada covered in an American flag alongside Greenland and Venezuela. He referred to Canada's former Prime Minister as Governor Trudeau. He said the tariffs were designed to create economic conditions that would make annexation easier. This wasn't a joke. This wasn't a negotiating tactic. This was a stated political objective. And Carney walked into the Oval Office in May 2025 and said, as you know from real estate, there are some places that are never for sale. We're sitting in one right now. Having met with the owners of Canada over the course of the campaign, it's not for sale, won't be for sale ever. Trump's response was, never say never. Carney's response to that, he silently mouthed the words, never, never, never. But that's not even the real story. The real story isn't the drama. The real story is what Carney did in parallel to the diplomacy. Because while he was standing firm on sovereignty in the Oval Office back home, he was building an economic architecture designed to ensure Canada could survive whatever came next. His government deployed a $6 billion resilience package, but not as a slush fund. As a precisely targeted set of economic shock absorbers. The employment insurance waiting period was eliminated for workers displaced by tariff shocks. $418 million pumped directly and immediately into the hands of affected workers. Separation payment rules were suspended. Another $424 million injected into the hands of claimants. A $10 billion loan facility was stood up for large employers facing politically motivated tariffs they couldn't have hedged against. And here's what nobody's talking about. Carney invested $450 million in workforce development, retraining programs designed to move up to 50,000 workers into new industries built around direct partnerships with unions and employers, not abstract government programs. Real pipelines from displaced workers to actual available jobs. This is not the behavior of a government that thinks it can negotiate its way out of this problem by being compliant enough. This is the behavior of a government that has looked at the situation clearly and concluded that the only real security is structural. That compliance, as Carney himself said at Davos, doesn't buy safety. That middle powers who rely on the goodwill of great powers are, in his words, on the menu. Now, what I'm about to show you changes the whole picture because there is a fascinating paradox buried inside Carney's strategy. He made concessions, significant ones. Canada dropped its digital services tax, the one that would have applied to the U.S.'s largest technology companies, because the U.S. Commerce Secretary called it a potential deal breaker in trade negotiations. Canada has committed significant funds to military spending at American behest. Canada has securitized the border in response to the fentanyl claims that its own data shows to be almost entirely fabricated. Canada even apparently allowed American oil companies to extract record profits from Canadian resources. Some critics inside Canada have looked at this list and asked, if you promised elbows up, why do you keep putting your elbows down? Carney's answer is essentially strategic. You absorb what you can absorb without sacrificing structural integrity. You give on the peripheral things to hold the core things. The core things, in his view, are sovereignty, USMCA membership, the right to diversify trade partners, and the absolute rejection of annexation. The question, and this is the analytical question that matters most right now, is whether that calculation is correct. Whether holding those 5 lines generates enough counter leverage to eventually change the dynamic, or whether it just delays an escalation that was always going to come regardless. Here's where I think this goes, and I want to be careful here because this situation is genuinely complex and the outcome is not predetermined. Carney has built something real. The trade diversification push, 12 deals, 4 continents, 6 months. That's not just optics. Canada's goal is to double its non-U.S. exports over the next decade. That's an enormous ambition, but it's grounded in the recognition that having 75% of your exports going to a single country that has started treating economic dependency as a weapon is not a sustainable position. The USMCA is up for review in 2026. This is the main event. Everything that has happened so far, the tariffs, the threats, the demands, the standoffs, has all been a negotiating prelude to that renegotiation. Trump wants wins. He wants concessions he can present to his base as proof that he got Canada to pay more, comply more, submit more. Carney has promised to sign a new deal only if it is genuinely good for Canada. He has explicitly said he will walk away from the table if the terms would make Canada the 51st state in all but name. But here's where it gets complicated. The economics underneath all of this are not neutral. Even with USMCA exemptions, even with the resilience package, even with the trade diversification push, Canada is under real pressure. The tariffs have been a genuine shock to specific sectors. Steel and aluminum mills have faced margins they couldn't have planned for. Auto parts manufacturers have had to route supply chains that took decades to optimize. The Canadian dollar has been volatile. Business investment has been constrained by the uncertainty alone. And there's a political dimension here that runs deeper than the trade files. Reports are coming in that supporting Canada for maintaining sovereignty against American pressure has actually strengthened Carney's domestic political position. Before annexation talk ever entered the conversation, Carney's Liberal Party was trailing by nearly 20 points in the polls. Then Donald Trump started openly floating the idea of absorbing Canada, and almost overnight, the Canadian political landscape transformed. What followed wasn't just a polling bounce, it was a surge of national unity, a closing of ranks. A moment where Canadians across party lines rallied behind Mark Carney, not because of ideology, but because sovereignty itself suddenly felt under threat. But nationalism is a volatile fuel. It burns hot, but it doesn't burn forever. It survives only as long as the danger feels real and the response feels strong. The moment Canadians begin to believe that firm words aren't being matched by meaningful leverage, that the elbows up posture is more slogan than strategy, that political capital starts to evaporate. And here's the turning point that most people missed. Just days ago, the United States House of Representatives voted 219 to 211 to terminate the national emergency Trump used to justify his tariffs on Canada. 6 Republicans openly defied Trump's threats to primary them, a quiet but significant crack in the coalition propping up this trade war. It wasn't enough to override a veto. Trump has already promised to block it. But it sent a message. The pressure is no longer one-sided. Because the pain of this conflict isn't falling only on Canada, it's spreading through the American economy. Farmers in the Midwest, auto plants in Michigan, manufacturers whose supply chains run straight through Ontario and Quebec. According to the Tax Foundation, Trump's tariffs now represent the largest effective tax increase on U.S. households since 1993, roughly $1,000 per family in 2025 alone, with even higher costs projected next year. The average tariff rate on U.S. imports has surged to its highest level since 1946. And Carney knows this. That's why Canada's retaliation isn't blunt. It's surgical, not a shotgun, a scalpel. Targeting industries and regions that matter politically, ensuring the economic pain lands precisely where it creates maximum pressure inside the American system itself. Which brings us to the real endgame. The USMCA renegotiation. This is the moment that decides everything. If Carney walks in holding the core lines, no annexation, no hollowing out Canadian industry, no surrendering the right to trade globally, and walks out with a deal that preserves North America's integrated economy, then every concession, every resilience fund, every diversification push, every warning delivered at the World Economic Forum will look like a masterclass in strategic defense against a far larger power. But if those demands harden, if tariffs keep climbing, if compromise turns into submission, then Canada will spend the next decade building something entirely new, an economy engineered for independence, not integration. Either way, the old world is gone. The era of good faith, rules-based economic cooperation ended the moment trade became a weapon. As Carney put it at Davos, this isn't a transition, it's a rupture. The real question now isn't whether Canada can survive this fight. It's what kind of country it becomes because of it, and whether its stand reshapes how every middle power on earth thinks about vulnerability in a world where economic strength is now a tool of coercion. So where do you think this goes? Is Carney drawing the right lines? Is patience the real leverage, or is he giving away too much to protect too little?